1 minute from our starting point, but we will not be bound by times, will we? No. So more words, more ideas to baffle the brain. This afternoon, then, we're going to look at section 4 on cycles. Cycles and time are two very obviously closely related, interrelated ideas. And Joy has already been expounding on the nature of time to some extent. And inevitably, as we talk about cycles, we cannot help but consider something about the nature of time as we perceive it. When I think of the key statements, which to me was most illuminating, is included in paragraph 4.1 in both cases, and really sets the keynote for this whole session. And that is where the Mahatma says, I've quoted it in both parts, realize but once the process of the Maha cycle of one sphere, and you have realized them all. It is as simple as that.
No problems.
No problems at all. Now, we are presented with, both in terms of experience and both in terms of idea, in terms of what we're told in our theosophical literature, of a wealth of cycles. I have indicated some of these in paragraph 4.2, where we talk about universal cycles, solar cycles, planetary cycles, and others as well. And to some limited extent this afternoon, we will be looking through some of those most close to us, most accessible to us. But I want you to hold fast to this one idea. Realize but once the Maha cycle, and you have realized them all. Bear in mind that every cycle we look at has but one pattern to it, and the sequence of events that take place in any given cycle are repeated in them all, either writ large or reflected in a much smaller cycle. And this idea is richly illustrated in the Mahatma letters, and whenever they give reference to cycles, there's always some sort of interrelation, or frequently there's some sort of backward reference to a larger cycle of which this is an aspect, or to a smaller cycle in which it is reflected. Just to give an illustration for the moment, which we will come back to later on, they talk of the cycle of human birth, human incarnation, from conception through the growth of the fetus, through birth and development, as reflecting the one cycle. And even the stages that the fetus goes through are used as illustration of the phases of universal cycle that we go through. We will be talking later on this afternoon about the early stages of any cycle acting as a recapitulation, going over again of phases that we would have been through before. And the fetus is said to recapitulate stages of the early development of physical mankind. In all of these cycles reflect one into another and are interrelated in this way. It doesn't really matter that we try and master the mathematical intricacies of 7 times 7 times 7 and so forth. Once you get the feel for the nature of what the cyclic process is about, I think you have the key which unlocks any of the detail which you then might be presented with. The mistake, and it's a very, very easy mistake to make, is to try and approach it in terms of detail, to try and master the intricacies of how many races in a sub-race and family races in offshoot races and globes and planetary rounds and solar manvantaras and so forth. Grasp the fundamentals of the cycle and the rest, I hope, will fall into place much more naturally. In order to grasp the fundamentals of the cycle, we have to a degree, re-educate ourselves as to the nature of time. Now, it's a funny thing to say, because time seems, in one sense, so simple, and this is because of the paradigm, to use Joy's term, or not Joy's term, but the term that Joy was using this morning, that we have accepted in the West, that of linear time. Now, we don't even, for the most part, recognize that there is anything that we have acquired by way of a paradigm. And that's exactly what these underlying assumptions are, something which is so obvious to us that you don't even see it any longer. And we think of time as past, present, future, as a linear process, and the further back in time you go, the more distant it becomes, and the further forward in imagination we go in the future, the more distant it becomes. And we see a vast, limitless array, spectrum of time, from an unimaginable past to an unimaginable future. And we find ourselves in this tiny little bit that we call the present, and we sort of shrink into it thinking, how can, this is insignificant. But this is the perspective that we have been taught, and there is another. Plainly so, there's a passage in the Secret Doctrine which, well, the first time you read it, is, to me it was an eye-opener, so I'll read it to you. It's on page 44 of Volume 1, in stanza 1, commentary on Sloka 6. The words of a Mahatma quoted by H.P.B. Right at the end of the commentary, at the top of the page if you're going to follow, in the words of a master, I feel irritated at having to use these three clumsy words, past, present and future, miserable concepts of the objective phases of the subjective whole. They are about as ill-adapted for the purpose as an axe for fine carving. Now, did you feel irritated at using past, present and future? It seemed perfectly natural to me until I read that. About as ill-adapted as an axe for fine carving. There's something terribly wrong. It's not like that, fairly plainly. And the way that we have to, the primary way that we have to view this process, instead of regarding time as a continuum with the past over here, the present as some imaginary line, and then the future someplace over here, if we talk about the concept of cycles, plainly what we have to look at is to revise our perception and think of it in terms of a circle. So, we'll put some little arrowheads in to show the direction or the apparent direction of time. Now, looked at from that point of view, there is no starting point and there is no end. What we have is a rolling process. We can arbitrarily say that this point represents the start as well as the end of the cycle, and if you like, we may say that this is the middle of the cycle. But who says so? Well, I do, and it's my concepts that have made it the beginning and the end. But this is completely arbitrary. It has no start, and it has no end. I think one of the nicest symbols, one of the most apt and appropriate symbols to denote this, is the Chinese symbol of the yin-yang. I should draw one black and one white, but I need not, because I'm sure you all know it. What's nice about this is that it shows and adds a dynamic aspect to the whole process. The one falls into the other. The head chases the tail, the other head chases the other tail, and the process continues to revolve on its own axis, one becoming the other, an eternal process of becoming. Rather than depicting it, I'd prefer that, if we have a simple symbol to represent the process of cycle, rather than arbitrarily drawing a circle with a line across it and saying that this half represents day and this half night, the two halves of a cycle. Okay, there's no harm in doing that. I prefer this because it gives me a much more fluid feel to the whole point. Consider, if you will, the actual day and night that we are familiar with, ordinary days and nights as we experience them. For the most part, day shades into night through twilight, night deepens into midnight, and then lightens towards dawn, shades into dawn, the false dawn which precedes the sunrise, and then the gradual sunrise, and depending on the amount of cloud, so it's a gradual process, and then the full sunlight of midday. It's all a gradual process, is it not? It's not points at which you can say, this is where the cycle of the day ends, apart from clock time, which says that it ends at midnight, and the next day starts 1 minute later. Without clocks, who was it saying? Joy was saying this morning, supposing we didn't have any clocks? Well, if you didn't have any clocks, you wouldn't think of it like that, would you? It's just a continuous rolling process. We have in the cycle of the day a perfect model of how all these cycles operate, and all the cycles that we can discuss can be based on this. And isn't it interesting that even in stanza 1 and the early stanzas of Cosmogenesis, they use just exactly these symbols, the luminous sons of Manvantaric dawn, and so forth, and right through to stanza 7, where it talks about the morning sunlight has now changed into the noonday glory. It's all part of this cyclic process, and the symbols which are used because they appeal to our psyches, because they appeal to our immediate experience. Cycles are not arbitrarily divided up, although I will probably in a little while go on to talk about some of the divisions. This is the important thing to grasp, the continuous flow round and round. There is no point at which the flow stops. There is no point in the flow which is more important than any other. I remember years ago a teacher of mine responding in answer to a questioner who said, why does the whole cyclic process start all over again? And he just said, it hasn't got any brakes. It can't stop. Yeah. There is no point in which it is actually moving any faster or any slower than any other. It is a continuous movement throughout the two halves of the cycle that we arbitrarily define as day and night. These sorts of perceptions are fundamental to it. Compare that view of time to that view. Instead of finding yourselves isolated in what seems an infinitesimally insignificant moment, dividing an endless past with an endless future, now you feel yourself comfortable in a cycle that you know, and in a cycle which may repeat itself, not exactly duplicated, learning and changing and growing, but you feel comfortable in an environment which you know and understand. And it's not a question of feeling yourself insignificant here, but feeling yourself at home in something of which you are a part. And no one point of the cycle is any more important or any less important than any other. What you arbitrarily experience as the present is no more or no less important than any other point in the cycle. One suspects that the Chinese, not the present Chinese, but the Chinese of some time ago, would have understood exactly this sort of perception of time just as intuitively as we understand and think of time like this. Their whole cultural pattern was based on this. Their literature was based on change. The book, the I Ching, the Book of Change, is based on this to begin to see that these things work in this way. Do not fall into the assumption of saying, oh, well, yes, but the periodicity that we see in days and nights just happens to be because our Earth revolves around its axis in relationship to the sun. This is trivial. Everything has a periodicity to it. If you look either at the macroscopic scale, at the astronomical scale, everything revolves about something. As from what astronomers tell us, the galaxy revolves about itself. The solar systems within the galaxy revolve about their centers, the sun. The suns revolve about other groups and so forth. The planets with their little planetary systems revolve about themselves. Their little moons revolve about themselves. If you look at that scale, you cannot get away from this cyclic patterning right throughout. And if you look at certainly if you look at nature as we experience it on our planet, cyclicity, periodicity is fundamental to that as well, is it not? And even at the microscopic and subatomic level, we see this sort of rhythmicity, to use choice word. I may cash in on this deal. It's a nice word, I like it. It flows off the tongue. Yeah. We will put that into the vocabulary, rhythmicity. I like it. Even down at the subatomic level, the vibratory and cyclic nature of the subatomic particles again is reflecting this pattern. All right. Well, that as the basic pattern then. Realize but once. The Maha cycle, and you have understood them all. But if we were to move on, then we would have to view this in other ways. So I will remove this, unless there are any questions you want to ask before I do, and move on to some other aspects of the subject.
Not a question, but on that top one, it looks as though we're all still members of the Flat Earth Society, doesn't it?
Terrible. And we know better, don't we, Muriel?
Well, I don't know, but...
Linear Earth, yes. Now, the picture that we are painting in here to remind us of what we're looking at is concerned with the information that we are given in the secret doctrine and allied literature about the cyclic processes more accurately as it relates to man. The information that we are given starts on a very large scale and works its way downward to scales with which we are more immediately familiar. And these are, to a degree, delineated in the text that you have in front of you. The cycles which we can refer to, which we will refer to, relate primarily to the planet itself. With that of the solar system, I think we need not primarily concern ourselves. It is too vast a scope, really, for us to take in. So let us limit our attentions to the planet. We saw from yesterday that the planet consists of 7 globes, and we've discussed a little bit about the nature of those globes, one amongst another. We know that the cycle of the evolution of mankind and the life waves of the 7 kingdoms have these 7 globes as their arena, their background, their stage. So we need a way in which to depict the way in which this cyclic journey is undertaken. And the way which I will use for the moment is this. I'm arbitrarily going to look only at the day part of the cycle. We can extend this diagram if we wish to cover the night of the cycle as well, but for the moment we'll just cover the day half, the manvantara. Now, this diagram that I'm about to draw is again none of my own invention, but one that you will find in the Mahatma letters, wherein they divide the circle into 7 segments. Rather than drawing the globes as they are drawn in the Secret Doctrine, as being variously arrayed on 7 planes, think of them as arranged around as 7 segments of a circle. So this represents our globes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. Thought of this way, it has a rather more holistic feel to it, that we are looking at a picture, at a symbol, wherein the thing is one process. Now, the information that we are given concerning the cycles as it relates to the kingdoms of nature, the actors in the drama, is that they have to pursue a cyclic journey through these globes. So the cyclic journey through these globes is what is called in the Mahatma letters and the Secret Doctrine planetary round. Now this is just really to establish terms, but it doesn't really tell us very much. Each of the 7 kingdoms has to undertake such a journey, and it apparently can not escape any one step in this cyclic journey. So this is the largest cycle with which we will be concerned, as far as this is concerned. Now, within the life period of the planet, each of these kingdoms has to make this journey 7 times. And between each cycle, it has a period of rest, a planetary pralaya. However, the picture, of course, is then made more complex when we consider that this pattern is then repeated in miniature on each of these globes. So let us imagine pattern 1 of these, just for sake of example, and we'll use globe D. After all, it's where we are. What I've drawn here, I could now repeat in miniature here. And I could say that in each of these globes, exactly the same process is now going to occur. Within this broad sweep, now what we have to do is evolve through 7 stages on each globe. And this subsection in here, is what HDB in the Secret Doctrine calls a globe round. Just terminology. One name's as good as another. So where we see this segment of the circle here, really what's involved is another cyclic evolution within the globe itself. Again, nobody can escape any part of this cyclic journey, it would seem. What is true of one kingdom is true of another. Once you've grasped this basic pattern that we have here, you have the pattern of the lot. Whether you then go on to subdivide one of these, all you're going to see is exactly the same thing repeated in miniature in any one of these segments here as well. What name we give to it and what appearance it takes, who knows? If you divided it far enough down, you would come to one individual incarnation, as far as you're concerned. One birth, one death. And within the span of that birth and death, you too will have gone through exactly the same 7 stages of birth, growth, development, maturity, old age, and death, in just exactly the same way. Understand at once the Maha cycle, and you have understood them all. Now, all of this ultimately leads us to this segment of the circle. We are told in the secret doctrine almost nothing about what takes place on globes A, B, C, D, E, F, and G. All that we're told relates pretty much to globe D. Why? Because you don't need to know the rest. Realize but once the Maha cycle, and you have realized them all. What takes place on globe D will, by analogy, also take place on each of the other globes. And seeing as we're not concerned with detail, but only with principle, it doesn't matter. But the stages here become important. Now, we have said that there will in fact be 7 planetary rounds. So we will go through this particular cycle 7 times, will we not? The first time, we will go through that cycle once. Second time, when we repeat this whole grand journey, when we arrive at globe D, we will go through this whole cyclic process again. So what we see here is repeated 7 times. And in terms of the literature, and especially in terms of what is presented in Volume 2 of the Secret Doctrine, we are concerned with the globe rounds as they relate to globe D and nothing else. It's amazing how little you are actually told in Anthropogenesis in Volume 2. A little bit is said about inference about the other rounds. We are told that we are in the 4th of these grand planetary rounds. Of the previous 3, we are told little or nothing. So we are here for the 4th time. And within this globe round, we are going through our current cyclic journey. And a little bit, we're really all the information that we're told is concerned with what's happening within this particular cycle. What's interesting is that we are told by inference more than explicitly. Because this cycle reflects the larger and the smaller cycles, we can infer from what is taking place here now what must have taken place in the larger picture. Not in detail, only in principle. And only the broadest picture is painted of what took place in the largest of contexts. So, when it comes to the details of the process and who does what and so forth, then the picture does get a little bit more interesting, a little bit more confusing too when it comes to that. Let's explore this a little bit further. Another colour. Let's add the actors into this drama. So far we've really only got the cycles. What about us? What about the 7 kingdoms of nature which we discussed on the first day? The surprising thing that we are told, it was surprising to me when I first read it because other literature I'd read rather suggested that it was somehow different from this. But what it so clearly says in the Secret Doctrine, in Mahatma Letters, and I've quoted this in the book, is that every kingdom of nature must go through this whole cyclic process. Now, in view of what we've said about cycles, does this not seem reasonable to you anyway? It's rather like, if you think that it's not the case and that we need only do a bit of the cycle, it's rather like saying, well, I don't really fancy the night much, or afternoons bore me, so I'll skip the afternoon and I'll go straight from morning to evening. You can't do this. If you're part of a process, whether you like it or not, nice or nasty, you go through all parts of that cycle. How much attention you pay to it is up to you, but nonetheless you must go through it. And if that's your cycle of growth and development, then that's what you must do. And so the largest picture, we are told that each of the 7 kingdoms must undertake this cyclic journey, the planetary round, 7 times. It's not as if some of us will only do it 4 times, and if we're really quick we could do it in 2. I mean, this is rather like saying that if I'm really bright, I could end my incarnation when I was 14 because I'd learned everything there was to learn in this incarnation, and I needn't go on any further. It's not like that, is it? Cycles are periods of growth and development, and we need the whole of the cycle in order to do that. If it were otherwise, then we wouldn't be involved in that sort of cycle, presumably. So each of the 7 kingdoms of nature has to evolve through these 7 planetary rounds. So therefore it would follow, I guess, fairly logically, would it not, that each of them will have to evolve on or in each of these globes, and on each of these globes will have to go through its own cyclic process, developing itself in that particular phase, whatever that might mean for that kingdom. We will discuss more about this and the appearance of this, I guess, in section 8 of the book, which we'll get round to at the beginning of next week. So I won't elaborate too much of this now. I'll leave a little bit more to be said at that time. However, just to start this process of explanation, and it is referred to in section 4, the 7 kingdoms in any given planetary round do not all start at the same time, apparently. Comes back to what we were saying yesterday about the forms of the kingdoms being built using cooperatively, one upon, you remember that pyramid that I drew yesterday, the mineral resting on the elemental, the plant resting on the mineral, and so forth. Well, if that is to be the case, it would make sense, would it not, if the elemental kingdoms had evolved ahead of time, thereby to leave behind the developed material on which the mineral kingdom could then build its forms. And so it is. The lower kingdoms start first and undertake their evolution through, let's say, globe A in the first round. It makes no difference. Realize but once the Maha cycle and you have realized them all. It's all the same. And just as the elemental in this particular case has finished its development on globe A and moves on now to do its corresponding evolution on globe B, so the next kingdom will follow on behind it, the mineral in this case, and will now utilize the developed material, if material we can call it, that the elemental has left behind, whatever it's dug the ground, so to speak, and now we can sow the seeds for the mineral, if this is not too mixed a metaphor. And then they move on. All right, so when the elemental now moves on to do its stuff on globe C, so everything else moves on a bit, and now the plant kingdom can start on globe A, using the developed forms that the mineral has now left behind it. And so it all moves on. As the elemental now moves on into here, we won't pursue this too much further, because otherwise the diagram will get unfollowable. Then, again, everything else moves on correspondingly. The mineral now moves on to here, the plant moves on to here, and now the animal can start its evolution on there, using, presumably, the legacy of the plant or vegetable kingdom now to make that additional step, which would mean the development of the first primitive animal forms within that particular environment. So again, rather than thinking of them in terms of separated globes, what we see here is a sort of broad sweep taking place, a series of waves following one another, each benefiting from the work done by its predecessor. However, one further factor now complicates this process, and again it's referred to in here, though quite exactly where, I really couldn't tell you. 4.6 on page 13 discusses the principle that I am about to elaborate. There is a beautiful economy in the nature of all of this. You might think that having got a head start, the mineral's got a head start on the plant a head start on the animal, then it might continue in that way, but apparently not a bit of it. As we move up the scale of the kingdoms of nature from plant to mineral, mineral to animal, animal to man, so the kingdoms take less time to evolve. The plant and animal require enormous periods of time. The plant to generate its multiple genera, is that the right way around, those species, and the animal with its genera, whichever way it is. The varieties of them require enormous periods of time to develop. Relatively, man is quite quick. Man does not have many physical types compared with the plant kingdom. Biologists would tell us how many hundreds of thousands of different species of plant there are and how many tens of thousands of animal species. Well, in terms of physical differences, man hasn't got that many, so we don't need to spend a lot of time developing a whole series of different forms. Our evolution is, after all, psychological and spiritual, and that, apparently, is much quicker. We change more readily within our sphere than the plant and the mineral does within its. The net effect of this is that we are running this race somewhat faster than those who started earlier than us. And the net effect is, apparently, so that we are told, that everybody finishes just exactly at the same time up here, if we were to follow this all back. Incredibly neat, isn't it? Everybody finishes their evolution. It says, there's a passage quoted from the Mahatma letters where it says, the passage on page 66, if you wish to follow this, which is the passage 4.6. In the early days, just I add in parenthesis, they didn't tell Sinnett that there were 7 globes. This was a teaching which only came later. It's interesting, we take so much for granted. So much for granted. I mean, you think 7 globes. Oh yes, 7 globes. Of course there are 7 globes. Wouldn't think of that. They didn't tell Sinnett that there were 7 globes till quite a while into the correspondence. Initially they used the letters A and Z. A to denote the first, Z to denote the last, without actually specifying how many there were in between. Don't assume that there were they thought there were 26 globes, and it just happened to be Z was the last letter of the alphabet. Later on they told him, and there's a letter where they said, I have just been allowed to give you the correct number. Allowed to give you the correct number. It wasn't his own decision. And so there are a lot of references to globe Z. Well, seeing as this is an American, we'll say Z. How about that? So, as in this passage here, then, on page 66, when all kingdoms have reached globe Z, here, they will not move forward to re-enter A, here, in precedence of man, but under a law of retardation, slowing down, operative from the central point. Well, here would be the central point, the middle of the cycle of the day. Operative from the central point, or Earth, after all that's us, globe D, to Z, so in other words, this half of the day cycle, and which equilibrates, makes equal, a principle of acceleration in the descending arc, so in other words, it's speeding up down here and getting slower as it goes up here. They will have just finished, that's all kingdoms will have just finished their respective evolution of genera and species when man has reached his highest development on globe Z in this or any round. Doesn't matter which round we talk about, this principle will always be true. So isn't that neat? You see, there's this beautiful economy in nature. There's a fitness to the whole thing, that it just winds itself up and all finish at approximately the same point. After that, there is the planetary pralaya, a period of rest for all 7 kingdoms, before they would start in again on the next planetary round, again repeating this whole process that we've just delineated here. How are we doing? Time runs away with me, doesn't it? Okay. In the notes that I've given you in the book, I have suggested, this is in paragraph 4.4, that there are two different perspectives that you can use in order to view this cyclic process. The two that I've talked about here are the evolution of the kingdoms, which we've just concentrated on. I've just been following through here a broad brush picture of the way in which the seven kingdoms will evolve. From this perspective, then the globes, A to G, just form the stage, the backdrop, the environment in which the whole process happens. Yesterday, when we were talking about the planet, you will recall that we said that each planet, and indeed each globe, is a life, is a being in its own right. And if that's the case, then not only are we evolving, we, the seven kingdoms, are evolving like this, but the globes are evolving as well. Isn't that an interesting point? Yeah? And looked at from that perspective, you end up with a very different picture. So if you'll forgive me, I'm going to take this picture off the board and put up another one. But before I do that, is there anything you want to ask me about this?
Would you say, just or this whole concept of acceleration and retardation, I think, is so very interesting in the light of what you said earlier about time. You say that the cycles, proceed, as we've said. But what do you think causes this acceleration retardation principle? The masters speak of it in other places in the Moral Letters.
They do. I suspect it's tied up with another facet of this whole cyclic process, which I hope to touch on, which I'll touch on now, seeing as you've raised the point. It's something which I guess is familiar to most of us anyway, and it's covered in point 4.8 in the notes, which is on page 13, for instance, where, as you probably know already, we talk about a descending arc, and the way it's, of course, depicted in this diagram lends itself to these terms. There is a descending arc from the first to the fourth, from A to D, and an ascending arc, as they refer to it, from the fourth, the middle point in the cycle, through to the culmination of the cycle, from D to G, from the fourth to the seventh part of the cycle. Now, when we say descending and ascending, why do we use these terms? It's not because we're talking about a diagram, you may be sure. That's pure coincidence that it works out that way. I could have just as well drawn the diagram upside down, in which case you'd have had an ascending arc followed by a descending arc. The terms of themselves are not significant. What is ascending and descending relates to spirit and matter. And we talk of a descent from spirit into matter, and an ascent from matter into spirit. And here again we have to be enormously careful about the use of terms. If you say a descent of spirit into matter, do not think that you're falling into a bucket of matter which happens to pre-exist you, and you end up with a sticky coat as a result of it. It's not so. It is not even remotely so. It is the spirit being transformed into matter. It's whatever it is that is undergoing the cyclic process, which is being transformed as it goes. The very fabric of its being, whatever it is using for expression, is of itself changing. This opens up, as the Americans would say, another can of worms, which is the development of the seven elements, which I shall be talking about in a later section. Anyway, we'll come back to that. But it is the development of the seven elements which brings about this descent, this process of transformation of the relatively subjective. Do you remember that passage that Joy read us out this morning, where it talked about the whole cosmic process of the transformation of the limitless subjective into the as limitless objective? It wasn't an expansion of into an existing volume, but it was a transformation of the subjective into the objective. It wasn't into another place which already existed, but it was the process of transformation which made the objective world. That principle that Joy talked about this morning is reflected in this whole cyclic process. What we call the arc of descent is this transformation process taking place for each kingdom. Now, think of the way this is going to happen. If the mineral is a little bit ahead of you, the mineral has already had a chance to go through this process a little bit ahead of you. So, as you move down this arc, the mineral has already gone through the process of being transformed from subjective into objective. So it's always a little bit more objective than you are. So it's always dragging you down with it. So it's pulling you along behind it, just because the very whatever it is that you must use to build your forms, your physical forms, is borrowed from the kingdom which is already a bit further on down this descending arc. The whole lot is pulling you on as it goes. So what is coming behind is being, in that sense, I think, accelerated behind you. So the higher kingdoms are accelerated relative to the lower kingdoms as they come down the descending arc. But now the whole thing inverts itself as you go back up the evolutionary arc, or the upward arc. And you are now in front, and they are behind. And they are going relatively slower and slower because they're going back to what is to them a relatively unnatural state, whereas you're going back to a relatively natural state, and you are moving that much faster. I don't know whether that's altogether clear, probably not, but it's the sort of thing that you can get a feel for, even if I wouldn't like to try and work out the mechanics of that. As HPV says in one place,
the gravitation have something to do there?
Gravitation? Not obviously, not the sorts of gravitation with which we are concerned. There is you might say, a spiritual gravity which is involved here. From the spirit to matter, the centrifugal and centripetal forces operative in nature are part and parcel of this process. That's about as best I can do, I think, Joy. Does that help?
I think that helps very much, but because that's something a lot of people get stuck on, this acceleration and retardation.
Right, right. We could probably work it out a bit more, but...
in other words, it really doesn't have to do with time, per se.
I don't believe so.
Again, we have to get away from linear time.
I believe so, yeah. There was another perspective on that, which I'll come back to. God, time willing.
And is there
Time is never willing.
Between the seventh round, between our being on Earth, the globe round, the planetary round, the solar round, are they all, is it to be inferred that they're all, I suppose, their correlation, you know?
Don't think I understand the question.
Well, we are supposed to be globe round 4.
Yes.
But would it be